Okay, here we go. This channel is focused primarily on trigram theory. These are the two Bagua arrangements of the trigrams, meaning the three lines. If you really want to understand what these videos are about, then you got to go to the first video and get the basic theory. And try to remember to say this at the beginning of every video. The basic theory is that the trigram represents a mind in time. In this particular video, you may not need to know all the details, but it certainly would be helpful if you want to get the full scope of what I'm trying to talk about. Now, I've talked about the diagrams, that is the four two lines in the center here, and I've had this kind of arrangement where I've talked about the relationship between all of these kind of moving together. But now I want to talk a little bit about a different way of looking at it. And, you know, when I first started thinking about this stuff, I tried talking to some people about it, but it's not easy to talk to people about this kind of thing. So there are very few people who had any interest whatsoever, and quite often, even if I was able to have a conversation about it a little bit with someone, it was very limited because it takes a little bit of investment to get familiarized with these languages. Or let's say this language. I mean, you could say these languages because there is this history. So, just think about yin and yang. That's like one whole barrier to entry. And then there's the question of what's being described in a trigram. And then there's the question of, well, what are these two arrangements about? That's a lot of barrier to entry to have a conversation. So much of the thinking about all this stuff occurred in relative isolation. But there were a few people who, while they weren't necessarily willing to go the whole way to learn this language and stuff, they were willing to talk about various things. And one person who a good friend of mine, I don't know if he would want to be identified, but let's just call him Tim for now. Whether his name is Tim or not, doesn't matter. I'll call him Tim. So, Tim, you know who I'm referring to if you're listening to this. So, Tim and I have had long conversations about a wide range of different things, and he and I have a very different perspective on things, but nevertheless, we're able to speak in some depth about things, and it's always interesting and somewhat frustrating, I think, for both of us, but at the same time, I've gotten a lot out of it. And recently, well, let me just say that, first of all, I think if it wasn't for some of the conversations that I had with Tim, I probably would never have bothered to try to present this, because he was one of the few people willing to at least entertain some of the things that I was thinking about, and gave me the sense that while maybe it wasn't necessarily the way that he thought of things, that it still had some merit and that it was worth pursuing. So that was incredibly helpful. And he and I have continued our dialogue over the years, and recently he made an interesting observation that I want to try to express, and of course I'm going to express it in my terms, so he will probably disagree with the way that I'm characterizing this, but what can I say? We see things in our own terms, and so what he said made me think of things in a different light. And so I want to focus on the diagrams for a moment, because what I've been saying in essence, this is kind of like the real kernel of the whole model that I'm working with. And this is, I've done some work with this type of model outside of the trigrams. So my sense of things is that the most basic way of describing what's going on in this existence is that we have an observer, and that observer is having an experience of phenomena. And so you could say this is like the basic unit of what's going on. Now, when I say what's going on, let's just put that in the realm of conscious beings, because that's what we're experiencing, right? And we can argue about whether or not this applies to so-called inert matter or not, and that's an interesting argument, but let's just put that aside for now, because when we say what's going on, in a certain sense, it doesn't matter what's going on if we're not experiencing it. So we are all having an experience. And in a certain sense, the observer inside of us is the one that's having the experience. I sometimes will refer to this as the experiencer. So you could say that experience is the mediation between the observer and the phenomena. And that's the way that I've been kind of thinking of the basic unit. So you can think of the diagram cycle as being, in essence, a description of experience, because experience is that interface between observer and phenomena. The diagram is essentially observer and phenomena. So I have often referred to the observer as being the top line, but it's somewhat arbitrary, really. What I would say really is that on the descending side, the yin line is the observer. And the reason for that is that when there's parity between observer and phenomena, then the observer has an understanding of the phenomena, and the phenomena is a decent experience. You can still be having a decent experience without having understanding. The observer can be lacking in their sense of what's going on and still be having a decent experience. But that would be the condition that would lead to a lousy experience. So the way I think of this, and I think this fits neatly with the postnatal arrangement, is that this is kind of like the dissolute party attitude of a civilization in decline. People who are partying can actually have a great experience. I mean, there may be a hangover and what have you, but they will think they're having a great time. But they will be misapprehending some basic aspect of things, you could say. Now, maybe it's, obviously there's plenty of other things. It's not just partying. There's all kinds of political movements which don't have a clear understanding of what's going on, but the people who are involved in them are still having a decent experience. So you could say, like right now, the people who are still enfranchised in the system are still able to, put food on the table and to have a decent quality of life, even though their perception of things is lacking. There are plenty of people already in this phase where there's a lousy experience happening. And I would say ever greater numbers in this experience. And I would say that, in some respects, all four of these are happening simultaneously. You could say that there is a characteristic kind of peak that will move around, but there's always outside data points on the bell curve. So a civilization will rise and fall, and within that, even as a civilization is rising, there'll be some who are still in this phase, right? So it's not a neat transition. It's basically a peak that goes around, and there's a distribution of all these things happening at all times. So there are some now who are trying to get their heads together, already having been in a lousy situation for a long time. And of course, that's not just within our civilization, it's within the world at large. There have been many people who have been having a terrible time of it, with a really horrible situation, a horrible experience, right? Because the phenomena that they're experiencing is extremely unpleasant, if not downright horrific. And we don't have to go into the details. You'd have to be living under a rock in order to not realize that that's what's going on, not only around the world, but in our country and in every country around the world. As far as I can tell, there's really no place on earth that has it all together for everyone. Some places are worse than others. At any rate, the point of this is that that's the basic model that I've been working with. And the conversation that I recently had with Tim suggested that that is a limited model. And what I got out of it is that really this model works well for the postnatal, but I'm going to suggest a different model based upon Tim's idea for the prenatal. So in the postnatal, because the observer is taking its experience as being of primary concern, this model makes the most sense. Indeed, the reason it's always made the most sense to me is that it seems to correspond most accurately with what is going on. I mean, can we in general agree that this is how things are experienced for us, that we're an observer having an experience and there's this phenomena occurring? That seems to be the way things are. But what's really going on? Well, what's really going on is that there's a lot of observers. Here's one, here's another, here's another. There's billions of them. And so, in essence, it's a field of perspectives. That's how Tim formulated it. And I think that's a nice way of saying it. When things are balanced out and you come to a kind of neutral state, because, Earth is the root and heaven is the goal. And so the individual sense of being is dissolved, and what you see is the totality of the field. So, this is, of course, somewhat hypothetical. I'm not sure to what extent I've ever experienced anything like that. I've had some experience of freeing myself from my own perspective, I guess, and of not being as attached to the experiences that I'm having. And I do know what it's like to neutralize thought objects in the mind. And I've always contemplated this idea that, of course, this world is populated with all kinds of perspectives. That's why I like hearing all kinds of different perspectives, and I don't really see, I see some as being more valuable to me than others, I suppose, but I think there's a degree of validity in all perspectives. And so this is really a better model for the prenatal. Now, I'm not entirely sure how that changes what's going on in the overall relationship between consciousness and phenomena. In some ways, this implies that the field is made up entirely of consciousness. And that corresponds nicely with wisdom traditions and a number of ideas that are currently percolating. There's something wonderful about that notion. So, if this is something which, in essence, resolves the duality, I'm not entirely sure the degree to which this really applies to it. There would be quite a distancing from it, is my sense. So you could think of, this is like the basic mechanism that causes one to feel and think in this way. And you could say that this is perhaps the healing that helps to resolve this problem. Because this is the historical problem of the relationship between consciousness and matter. And the kind of inexorable process of matter being transformed in some way that consciousness doesn't want, and consciousness is kind of dragged into a world it doesn't want to be a part of and has to figure out some new attitude in order to bring itself into alignment with what's happening. So, if you're able to kind of see that as a basic element of what's happening within the field, then it seems that, that there's a fair amount of distance that can be gotten from this drama. And certainly in times of strife and chaos and confusion, that seems like it would be helpful if not to actually resolve the chaos, turmoil, confusion, what have you, then at least to find some degree of peace and acceptance while we go through what appears to be an inexorable process. I think that pretty much covers everything that I wanted to say here. So rather than belabor it by saying anything else, I'll just close this by encouraging you to take a look at the rest of the videos on this channel if you find this of interest. And if you wish to support these efforts, there are a number of ways you can do it. If you don't have any extra money lying around, which I know most of us don't right now, then just kind of telling any people who you think might find this interesting, or liking and subscribing to the channel and all that jazz, can be really helpful. And if you do want to support, because you do happen to be one of those people who still have a little money lying around and you like to spread it around, that's greatly appreciated. The best way to do it for me is to go to the Patreon page, patreon.com/taijireality. And there's a PayPal email address, taijireality@gmail.com. And if you have crypto lying around that you want to unload, shoot me an email. We'll figure that out. I appreciate feedback. That's also really helpful. So if you have comments, criticisms, questions, what have you, do get in touch. And until next time, I bid you farewell and adios.